In 2013, the police of Melbourne, Australia, opened an investigation into Cardinal Pell. Now, mind you, that at the time, no victim had come forward for any reason, no specific crime was even mentioned, nor had any criminal complaints been made against him. So, the question arises, well, what was the investigation grounded in? And that question remained unanswered until a year later, in 2014, when emails exchanged between senior officials and officers detailed how the investigation was meant to generate headlines against Cardinal Pell. He was, after all, a prominent conservative and a religious voice that had tremendous influence that had to be managed by them. Finally, in 2017, they put Pell on trial for accusations of child abuse. Despite the fact one of the two alleged victims denied that it ever even happened, along with the impossibility of anything happening in an open sacristy of a cathedral during the high traffic period of masses, the absence of any witnesses or any evidence from the prosecution whatsoever, and the robust evidence and team of witnesses from the defense about Cardinal Pell's whereabouts at the time of the alleged event. None of that mattered. In the end, Pell was convicted in what the Supreme Court would later call a sham trial, and he quickly found himself sitting in solitary confinement, a victim of a long orchestrated attempt to silence him. Now, this is where we can speculate a little bit. You can imagine him sitting there in his cell, going back in his mind to the joy of his seminary days, when everything was very exciting and there was the whole adventure of following the Lord, casting his whole life into his arms without a crystal ball of where any of this might go. And then knowing that every yes he gave to the Lord led him here to this moment in this cell with these people, his reputation destroyed, his freedom stolen, surrounded by prisoners holding him in contempt for crimes that he actually never committed. Did he wonder whether or not he made a mistake in following the Lord? You duped me, O Lord, and I let myself be duped. You were too strong for me, and you triumphed. Now all day I am an object of laughter. Everyone mocks me. These words, of course, are taken from Jeremiah, which is the excerpt of today's readings. And Jeremiah is saying this as an entire nation is closing in on him, and his yes to the Lord had led him into a life of rejection, imprisonment, and the victim of constant scheming by others. Very much like Cardinal Pell. So what are we to make of that? The first thing that's important to clarify is that God didn't dupe Jeremiah the way that we tend to hear that word. Jeremiah wasn't deceived. There were no tricks that were committed by God. The Hebrew word here that's employed is translated in the church's tradition, for example, in the Latin Vulgate by St. Jerome and spiritual writers like John of the Cross, as seduced. You seduced me, O Lord, and I let myself be seduced. In other words, God drew Jeremiah to himself through the attraction of his infinite beauty that compelled him in such an intoxicating kind of a way to choose him until Jeremiah would freely surrender to God's call to be his prophet. And the suffering that he experiences is simply the byproduct of that love, because it's love lived in a world that rejects God, that he has wedded himself to. And herein lies the crux for every Catholic. Jesus says, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Why? Because you are loving God in a world that hates him. The world that rejects God, his Son, his gospel, and the entire invitation to a new life. And since the ascension, the major form that rejection is going to take is to reject his followers, because you're the most immediately accessible feature of God's life. as it did Cardinal Pell, and as it will do to us the more deeply we enter into the mystery of God's love. Not quite a selling feature, is it, really? No wonder evangelization is so hard. It's an undesirable situation, I admit that. It's not one that I think we would want to be in. But the question you have to ask yourself today is, what are you going to do about that? How can you ignore, especially when you've encountered the overwhelming beauty and the goodness of God? How could you pretend that it doesn't exist, that you didn't taste it for yourself, and that you don't know it? A beauty and a goodness that intoxicates the soul and fills it with profound longing. St. Patrick, reflecting on his own life, says, "Before, I was like a stone lying in deep mire. And he that is mighty came, and in his mercy raised me up, and indeed lifted me high up and placed me on top of the wall." So what's St. Patrick going to do? Ignore the same God that loves him in this way that he's personally encountered? Of course he's not. Which is why he willingly embraced the sufferings that came with his missionary vocation back to Ireland. You think of St. Augustine, who says, "O beauty ever ancient, ever new, late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside, and it was there that I searched for you. In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for you. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and thirst for more. You touched me, and I burned for your peace." What's Augustine going to do? Pretend this didn't happen? In fact, because of this, Augustine instead embraced the detraction of his enemies, who constantly during his ministry resurfaced the errors of his past, and instead persevered in serving the Lord as a bishop. So in the end, there's really no amount of suffering or persecution which Jeremiah, Cardinal Pell, St. Patrick, St. Augustine, or any of them had suffered that led them away from the God who had already seduced their hearts. But it's the same God in all of his beauty who comes and visits us. And he visits us most profoundly in the gift of the Blessed Sacrament, the sacrament of God's divine love, the flesh of Christ's Sacred Heart, given to strengthen us during the hardships, the inevitable hardships of life, so that we would be filled with his peace and have the courage to be the prophets that he made us to be from the moment of our baptism. So what am I going to say to you? Turn away from the cross out of fear? No. I'm going to say to you that the cross is going to be there. There's no question. But your strategy should be to visit that God, to encounter that love, and know that perhaps through it, others may ask you for the reason for your joy and so be saved. Because Christ promises a cross to those who seek to follow him, but he also promises to be there when we carry it, so that we wouldn't carry it alone. And while this might come as uncomfortable news, the heart that has been captured by the beauty of God will always consider every splinter worth the gain.